and welcome to Cardiac Radio for Teens. First of all, I'd like to wish you all a very happy new year and that you guys can all have a great year in 2017. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Bia, and Cardiac Radio for Teens is a place where teens can come together with other teens and learn about Spiritist teachings and topics and understand it and put it in a way for us to understand instead of the way maybe adults understand or they understood hundreds of years ago. As you all know, we have been reading the Spirits book together, going through question by question, so making sure that we understand it. And today we're starting off with question 100, which is exciting that we've gotten so far. But at the same time, there's still lots and lots to learn, so get ready. And question 100 is a little bit special because it's not exactly a question at all. It's just kind of the spirits ranting, and they kind of just talked, and we put that in as a question. But it's just information that they're giving us, and it goes on for paragraphs, so we'll split it up and go through it piece by piece. And this section is called the Spirit Hierarchy. So, question 100. Preliminary observance. The classification of spirits is based on their degree of development, the qualities they have acquired, and the imperfections from which they have not yet freed themselves. This classification is by no means absolute. No single category displays a well-defined characteristic except as a group. The transition is hardly noticeable from one degree to the next. The gradations blend together at their borders, much like what occurs in the kingdom of nature, in the colors of the rainbow, or even the different phases of human life. Thus, we may form a larger or smaller number of classes, depending on how we consider the subject. Such is the case with all systems of scientific classification. So before we move on, let's just go over and understand that little piece. So what they're saying is that the classifications of spirits, the way that they're kind of ranked, like a hierarchy is like, if we think of in Egypt, how there was the pharaoh on top, and then there was the knight, or that's English, but then there was the nobles, and then there was the people who had a skilled trade, and then there was the farmers, and then there was peasants and slaves. So in that kind of hierarchy, if we're going from top to bottom, like a little pyramid, if we're putting spirits in different categories of the pyramid, it depends on their degree of development, so how far they've developed, the qualities they've acquired, so what have they learned, what good traits do they have, and imperfections that they haven't freed themselves from. So sometimes people have a little imperfection, a little small detail that they need to fix, but sometimes it's a big imperfection, so that could separate them in different levels. So putting these together is how they put themselves in these different little categories of this bigger triangle. And then the next little part, they say how the classifications, these little parts in the triangle, it's not like Egypt where it couldn't move at all, that if you were a slave, you were going to be a slave forever. You're not going to somehow become a noble. But here you can change if you get over an imperfection, if you perfect that imperfection, if you develop more, you can move, and they're by no means like you have to stay here. You can move freely as you develop. And they're saying that also, that it's kind of like a rainbow, how the colors kind of mix together. You can say, okay, here's the good and here's the bad. Here's purple and there's blue. You can't just split it up exactly. There's parts where it mixes, and that would be like if someone has accomplished patience, but maybe they haven't accomplished kindness fully yet. But then someone else has the opposite. So you can't split them up based on that. So it kind of blends together on this line. We're not exactly, okay, you're on this side, you're on that side. And we can split it up into as many levels as we want, because we can be looking, if we're looking at animals, we could be looking at them and say, okay, there's two types of animals. Mammals and not mammals, right? Or animals that live in the water or that live on land. And we split it up in two categories and that's it. Or we can split it up into every single type of animal. Or we can split it up into, if there's a cat, you can split it up to the different species of cats. And then so we can split it up into so many ways or just a few ways. So it's not a defined thing. It's just based on how they're deciding. So usually they split up into 3 main categories, but we can split up into millions of little categories in between them. So let's continue where we were. Such is the case with all systems of scientific classification. Such systems may entail various degrees of completeness, reasonableness, or convenience for the intellect. Whichever way they are viewed, however, in reality they change nothing regarding science itself. In this regard, the spirits questions about this could be given various answers as to the number of categories without harming the overall idea. There are persons who have rather latched on to this seeming contradiction without considering the fact that spirits do not give any importance to what is purely conventional. For them, the thought is everything. To us, they leave the form, the choice of terms, and the classifications, in a word, the systems. So here they kind of said that you can ask a whole bunch of spirits, and they may say that there's different levels. One might say there's 2 different types, and one might say there's 1,000,000 different types. So they could all be right, and that it's not and it doesn't make them any different. It's the same overall idea. It's the same concept. It's just looking at it different. And they're saying what the concept, the thought, that's what's important. And to us, we can call them whatever we want. We can specify specifically. But what's really important is the concepts, not the terms or the classifications. Furthermore, we would add yet one more consideration that we must always bear in mind. Among spirits, as among human beings, there are some who are very ignorant, and we must always be on our guard against the tendencies to believe that they know everything simply because they are spirits. Every attempt at classification demands a methodology, a methodical analysis, and an in-depth knowledge of the subject. In addition, just as there are ignorant individuals in this world, there are those in spirit world with limited knowledge, who are incapable of learning and formulating any kind of system. They only know to comprehend any classification imperfectly. To them, all spirits, who are more highly evolved than themselves, are of the first class, because they cannot discern the difference of knowledge, ability, and morality, as would be the case with an uneducated person among us in relation to learned individuals. So while they say that if you ask different spirits, they might say different things, and those things are right, though even though they're different answers, they'll still be right. They're saying that we have to be careful with ignorant spirits who just don't know. They just think they know everything, but they don't. So it's like if you're asking a baby to know the difference between a doctor, a teacher, or whatever. So you're asking them to specify the difference, but they're babies. They don't know. They just know that they're more advanced. They went to college, they got their degree, they have a job. That's all they know. So they don't really see a difference. They just see, okay, you're older than me, you're more elevated, and that's it. So to some spirits, it's just like that. Anyone who's more elevated, who's above them, they're all just the upper level, and then everyone below them is just the lower level. So we have to be careful from taking advice from these ignorant spirits, because they might not exactly be certain of what they're saying. Even those who may be capable of formulating a system can vary in details according to their own points of view, especially when a division has nothing absolute about it. Linnaeus, Josiah, and Tournefort each have their own methods, but botany does not change because of it. They invented neither plant nor their characteristics, but merely observed analogies, forming groups and classes accordingly. We have done the same. We invented neither spirits nor their characteristics. Rather, we watched and observed. We judged by their words and acts, and afterwards we classified them according to their similarities, basing our classifications on the data they themselves have furnished us. So here they're comparing it to when people were classifying plants. So the people didn't they didn't invent the plant. They didn't invent that the plant was green. They didn't invent the characteristics, but they just watched and they observed and they saw, okay, this plant is different from this plant and this plant is different from that, and they just classified because they were observing. But we didn't do anything to invent it. So just like the spirits are saying that we didn't invent spirits, we didn't invent their characteristics. We're just watching and putting them in certain places and classifying them, but we didn't invent anything. The spirits generally acknowledge three main categories or large divisions. In the last category, and at the bottom of the scale, are the imperfect spirits, characterized by the predominance of matter over spirit, and an inclination towards evil. Those of the second are characterized by a predominance of the spirit nature over matter, and the desire to practice the good. They are good spirits. And finally, the first category includes the pure spirits, who have reached the highest degree of purification. So here we kind of talked about this in previous shows, and so they split it up into three main categories. So on the bottom, the third is, if we think about the triangle again, the third are the imperfect spirits. So they are still very material. They're still attached to material things like money and like greed and wealth and all that. And they still are inclined to do more evil. So if they're faced with good and evil, they're more inclined to do the evil. And then those are the second layer, if we're thinking of the triangle, the one in the middle. Those, they understand that nature is more important than matter, than material things, and they're trying to do good. Maybe they're not able to do good every time, but they desire to do the good, and they're trying to do good. And then at the top of the triangle are the pure spirits, who have reached purification, and they're at the highest degree. And just like if we're thinking about a triangle, how there's less on the top, it's because there's fewer of them because they're so pure. They're spirits such as Jesus. This division seems perfectly rational and displays well-defined characteristics, leaving us only to discern, through a sufficient number of subcategories, the main nuisances of each group as a whole. That is what we did with the help of the spirits, whose benevolent instructions have never failed us. So they're saying, okay, we have the basics, but it's when we go into the smaller details or when it gets a little bit harder. With the aid of the following classifications, it will be easy to determine the order and degree of the highly evolved or less evolved spirits with whom we may associate, and consequently the degree of trust and esteem they deserve. In some ways, this is the key to Spiritist science, because it alone can explain to us the anomalies that sometimes appear in communications, by enlightening us regarding spirits' intellectual and moral inequalities. However, we should note that spirits do not perpetually and exclusively belong to this or that class. Their progress is gradual, and since it often occurs in more than one area than another at a given time, they can display characteristics of several categories, a fact which is easy to discern through their language and acts. So here, what they're saying is that by learning the different categories of spirits, it can help us to understand why, when communicating with spirits, some spirits are completely off, because some are not as evolved. And when we're learning, we can learn that not only are spirits in one category, they can have some good qualities and some bad qualities, and they can be mixing, and they can get better. You're not stuck. If you're in the third one, you're not stuck in the third one. You can move up and eventually be in the first one. And now that's the end of 100. And now on to 101, which is the same way. It's a whole bunch of paragraphs, question 101, and the title is Third Order, Imperfect Spirits. So obviously we'll be talking about that third level, the biggest level of that triangle. General characteristics: predominance of matter over spirit, a propensity towards evil, ignorance, pride, selfishness, and all the evil passions that result from them. So right there they say, just a general clean-cut thing is that they're still attached to material things, they are still guided towards evil, like we were talking about before, and like ignorance, pride, and selfishness, and all the other things that come along with having those three. They have an intuition of God, but they do not comprehend God. So they think, okay, maybe there's a God. They have a little feeling, but they don't understand it at all. Not all are essentially evil, however. Some are more frivolous, thoughtless, and malicious than downright wicked. Some do neither good nor evil, but the simple fact that they do no good reveals them to be imperfect. However, there are others who take pleasure in wickedness per se, and are gratified when they find the opportunity to practice it. So here we are already splitting up the third level, because they're saying, okay, there's some that maybe they just don't know. They're just trying to have a good time. They're not thinking about being mean. They're not being evil, but they just don't understand, and they're just doing silly jokes on people, kind of. They're not trying to hurt someone, but they're joking around. And there's also those in the third level that they're not evil at all, but they don't do anything good either. So that makes them imperfect, because they're just doing nothing, basically. They're not doing good or evil. But then there are those who are really wicked, and they know that they're doing something bad, and they still do it anyway. They're doing it because they want to be bad. Third order spirits can ally intelligence with wickedness or malice, but regardless of their intellectual development, their ideas lack elevation, and their sentiments are more or less contemptible. So their wickedness, because sometimes to do something so horrible, you have to have a plan, you have to have intelligence. So just because they have an intellectual development, maybe it's the wrong intellectual development, maybe it's not the right direction of development, and it's the lack of elevation. So maybe you know a lot of stuff, but you only know the bad stuff, so it's not elevated stuff that you know. Their knowledge about the things of the world is limited, and the little do they know is confusing, and the ideas and prejudice of corporeal life. They cannot give us more than faulty and incomplete ideas of that world, but the attentive observer may frequently find their faulty communication great truths taught by the high purified spirits. So usually their knowledge is very limited. So like if you were communicating with the spirits, they would not have real answers to give us. And they're saying that the spirits have ways. They've taught us how to get your way through these faulty communications. Their characteristic is revealed by their language. Every spirit who betrays an evil thought in its communication can be placed in the third order. Consequently, every evil thought may also be suggested to come from a spirit of this order. So, if there's an evil thought, or if you're communicating and they say something evil, something that you know is bad, then you can put them in that third category. They see the happiness of the good spirits, a sight that tortures them endlessly, because they experience all the anguish and that envy and jealousy can produce. So they see the good spirits, the ones in the second level, and they're tortured by it. They're saying they're tortured because they're jealous and they're envious of the happiness that they have. So that shows another imperfection that they have, is this jealousy and envy. They also retain the memory and perception of the suffering of their corporeal life, and this impression is often more painful than it was in reality itself. Therefore, they indeed suffer from the wrong they themselves endure, and from those they caused others. And since they suffer for a very long time, they believe they will continue to suffer forever, a belief allowed by God as a punishment. So when they do horrible things on earth, when they're spirits, they continue to suffer. It doesn't go away, because they have to learn from their mistakes. So they think it's God punishing them, and since it goes on for such a long time, they think that it's going to be forever. But in reality, it's not forever, but they just have to learn so they don't do it again. It's like when you do something like when you're little and you color on the table instead of the paper, and then you get a timeout, so you learn, but it's not, you may think it's forever. When it's like 2 minutes, you think it's forever, but it's really not. It's just to learn from your mistakes. And then what we'll leave off today is they say that we may divide these spirits into 5 principal classes. So when we're looking at this pyramid, we have 3 big groups, and now we're going to split them up into a total of 10. But in the lower level itself has 5. So the third level has 5 separate levels, the second level has 4 separate levels, and the first one, it's just 1. But that's a long section. I don't want to leave off at different spirits at different levels, so we'll leave it off there and we'll continue. We'll go through all 10 levels next time. I know we're going to cut it a little short today, but just so that we can understand all the levels at the same time, I don't want to split the 10 in half or do number 10 now and leave the rest for later. So we'll just cut a little bit short today. But before we leave off, of course, I want to read our daily book of positive quotations. For today's date, January 3rd, we're back at the beginning of the book, and this one's titled Self-Talk. People don't just get upset. They contribute to their upsetness. It's not the event in our lives that upset us. It's how we think about them. If something bad happens, we might complain and fear we'll never feel better ever again. But someone else in the same situation might say, "Gee, that's too bad, but I know I can handle it." The same event, 2 different perspectives. We can't control many things that happen to us, but we can control how we react to them. I'd like things to go my way, but really, there's nothing that says they should. I need to remind myself that I have what it takes to improve my mood and my life. So I hope we can take that message into our first week of the new year and really try and see if we can make situations better just by our attitude. I'm Bia, and this is Cardiac Radio for Teens. Thank you all for listening. This has been Cardiac Radio for Teens. Thank you all for listening.